Alright, this chapter is all about various tips and tricks. Just little tools I may not have mentioned yet, and some mistakes beginners might encounter while learning Blender. This part is about mesh editing. First up is the spacebar. So with this weird thing selected over here, I'm going to press spacebar. And up pops a menu that has basically all of the tools in Blender listed, and even a search field at the top so you can search for a specific tool. So if you forget the hotkey for a certain tool and you forget where it is in the menus, you can simply type it in here. So if I forgot the hotkey for rotate, I just type in rotate, and here it pops up and it even shows you the hotkey. Now you can click on that to activate that tool. Let's use it for something more complex. In front view, I'm going to go into edit mode of this weird thing. Select all the vertices, and let's say I want to shear this. Now shear is a tool that kind of brings the top of it one direction and the bottom the other direction. So the hotkey for shear is kind of complex, and you might forget what it is. It's Control, Alt, Shift, and S. So that's the hotkey for shear. You might forget what that is very easily. If you do, press spacebar and simply type in shear. And there's the tool with the hotkey right next to it. Up next is a tool called splitting. Say we want to select a part of this sphere, or this weird little mine thing, and we want to move this away from the rest of that mesh, but it's connected to it, so we're going to have to split it apart. So with that selection made, press the Y key, and it splits it apart. It makes it its own piece. Now we can move it away from it. Next up is mask editing. Mask editing is just like it is in paint programs. It will hide everything else except the area that you're working on. So if you press Alt and B while in edit mode and draw a box over the area you want to work on, it hides everything else so that you can just focus on this little area. So after you're done making your changes, you can press Alt and B to remove the mask. And this also works in object mode. Press Alt and B, draw your mask, and everything's hidden except the area you've selected. And press Alt and B to unhide everything. In edit mode you can just you can make a selection and press the H key to hide it, and then Alt H to unhide it, but sometimes mask editing is more useful. And obviously it's easier. You don't have to select the exact vertices you want hidden. Just select the area that you want to focus on. Alright, so that's it for mask editing. Next up is triangulation, which is the process of turning a quad or an n-gon into multiple triangles. So let's go over here to our cube and go into edit mode. Let's select everything and press Control and T. That's the hotkey for triangulating. So that just turned all of those quads into two triangles each. Now to make all of these triangles quads again, press Alt and J. And Blender will make all adjacent triangles come together to form a quad, as long as the face won't be too distorted if it does so. Let me show you the usefulness of triangulation. Let's say we take the corner of the cube here, and we pull it far over like that. Now this side of the cube is a really distorted quad. It's kind of strange looking when you rotate the view. So let's make that into two triangles by triangulating it. So let's select those four vertices so that that face is selected, and press Control and T to add that extra edge and make this two triangles. Now that looks like it makes much more sense. Press Control and Z to undo that. Let's triangulate it a different way. Let's press Control. Now you'll see it triangulated it, but it added the edge a different way, in a different direction. So the two hotkeys for triangulation are Control and T, and alternatively Control Shift and T, which triangulates it a different way. Now let's select the entire cube thing. Press Control and T to triangulate everything. Now let's say we made this whole selection here and we want to make all of these triangles back into quads. So we learned how to do that. Press Alt and J. Problem is, only some of the faces were made back into quads. It's because Blender won't make a face like this, won't make triangles like this into a quad again, because it's going to result in a face that's too distorted. So it's just going to leave that as triangles. Blender's smart like that. Same thing with the top face and the side face over here. So Alt and J doesn't join all triangles together. It only does so if the result is a half-decent quad. Now one other way to change two triangles into a quad, and let me triangulate all this again, press Control and T. Another way to change two triangles into a quad is to select both triangles like that and press the F key. So it just makes those two triangles into a quad again. That only works for individual faces, obviously. So there's the basics of triangulating. It gives you a little bit more control over the shape of some of the faces. Alright, next up is dissolving. Let's move over to our weird sphere again. Dissolving is just an alternative to deleting. If I were to say take this vertex right here, press X, and delete that vertex, it leaves us with this big hole. Let me undo that. Now say I want to get rid of this vertex, but I don't want to make a hole there. I just want it to act like that vertex was never even there. That's what dissolving's for. When you dissolve something, Blender tries its hardest to make that area look the same as it does now, but just get rid of the selection that you made. So press X again with that vertex selected and choose Dissolve Vertices. Boom. So the vertex is gone and we're left with this n-gon here instead of a hole. And you can do that for as many of these vertices as you want, but you'll see sometimes it gets kind of weird. Blender tries its best to keep that area looking the same. But if you delete too much of the geometry, if you dissolve too much of the geometry, you're obviously going to get some weird results like this. But you get the idea. Dissolve just tries to act like your selection never even existed. And that does it for the mesh editing portion of this. Now we're going to move on to some animating tips. First up for animation tips is that almost everything can be animated, even most values in fields in Blender. So let's select this default cube and let's give it a quick material. Well, it already has a default material. Good. Work's done for us already. We're going to animate the color of this cube. So right now its color is almost white. Hover the mouse over the color field here and press the I key. You'll see it has this yellow border around it now. That means a keyframe was just added for that color field at frame 1. Now let's move forward to frame 20 and let's change the color. Let's make it red. Now press an I over the color field again at frame 20 and let's go back to frame 1. It's white again, so let's press Alt and A to play this animation and see what happens. Boom. So from frame 1 to 20 it goes from white to red. Let's go to frame 40 and change the color to blue. Press I while hovered over the color and it inserts a keyframe. And let's see what this looks like. Let's go back to frame 1, press Alt and A, and that's pretty cool. And that doesn't just work for color. That'll work for intensity here, that'll work for the specular value, that'll work for the emit value there. It works for pretty much everything. And not just in the material settings. If we add Let's say we add a, what can we do, what can we do, what can we do? Let's add a simple deform modifier to the cube that twists it. And at frame 1, hover over the angle here, press the I key, you'll see it turns yellow, so a keyframe was added to it. Now go to frame 40 and change the angle so that it's twisting the other way. Press I over the angle value to insert the keyframe. Go back to frame 1, press Alt and A, let's see what happens. So as you can see, pretty much every field in Blender can be animated just by hovering over it and pressing the I key. This part of the chapter is just going to go over a couple of common mistakes. So here's a cube that we UV mapped from a previous chapter. The first common mistake is forgetting about the tool options in the side toolbar at the bottom here. This little area hides lots of super useful options when you modify an object or when you add an object. For example, we're in edit mode of this cube here, and I'm going to loop select these edges right there. And I want to slide this edge up closer to this corner. So to do that, we'll use the edge slide tool. So press G, and then press G again to enable edge slide. And let's slide that to the top there. And left click to confirm that. You'll see that it stretches out all the UVs though. It stretches out the textures. But we can correct that, because once we left click there and confirm that edge slide, some options pop up down here in the toolbar. So our edge slide options are factor, which we can manually change the value of the edge slide, and also this field right here called correct UVs. Enable that, and you'll see that it fixes the textures automatically. So let's slide the edge up and down now, and you'll see it's no longer affecting our textures. It's correcting the UVs, which means it's basically sliding the UVs around as we slide the vertices around. So that's cool. You can slide edges without ruining your texture. And let's get out of edit mode on that and delete that. Now for something simple. Press Shift and A, add a UV sphere. Look at all the options you get after you add the UV sphere. You can change how many segments the sphere has. You can change how many rings it has. You can change the size of it. Oops, I have a little bit too much detail. Let's go back down to 12 and 12. Its scale, its location, its rotation. And every object you add will have options over here. So if you don't have this toolbar open when you add something or modify something, you're going to be missing out on all these extra options. In this part, we're going to be going over a couple more things. First thing I'm going to teach you is how to snap objects to curvy surfaces. So here we have our curvy surface, and we have our object, which is a cone. Now the goal is, I want to duplicate this cone and move it and rotate it to sit on top of the surface right beneath it and rotate with it, just like that. But doing that manually is kind of tedious. Kind of have to rotate it manually and then move it down to sit on top of the surface perfectly, and that's crap. Let's automate this and make it a lot easier. Let's select our cone, and in side view, zoom in, and you'll notice the origin point is flush with the base of the cone. It's because the origin is what's going to be sitting on top of the surface. So everything you want visible should be above the origin point. Alright, now we're going to play with the snapping options to make this possible. So turn on the snapping options, or turn in snapping by clicking on this magnet icon. Press G to move it around. You'll see it snapping to the grid as you move it. That's because right now it's set on increment. So change this option here from increment to face. Now press G and move it along, and you'll see something's happening, but not really what we want. That's because we need to change this so that it uses the origin point to sit on top of the surface. So change it from closest here to active. And now it's snapping to the surface, but it's not rotating with it. To get that to happen, select this option here, and the tooltip says Align Rotation with the Snapping Target. Enable that, and now move it. You'll see there's definitely some rotation going on, but the cone looks like it's upside down. If you have this problem, that's because the normals of all these faces aren't facing the right direction. To fix that, select your object, select your surface object, go into edit mode, select everything, and press Ctrl and N to recalculate the normals so all the faces are facing outward. Get out of edit mode, select the cone, press G to move it, and let's see if that worked. And it's perfect. So now we can duplicate this and move it along the surface, and it's going to sit directly on top of the surface and rotate with those normals beneath it. Perfect. Now for this to work correctly, the object's z-axis has to be pointed up, so you should have created your cone in top view. If the object you're using isn't aligning properly with the curve, you can fix that by simply going into edit mode and rotating the vertices until everything's aligned properly. And when you're finished using these snapping options to do whatever it is you need to do, make sure you reset it back to increment and disable the magnet. That way when you go to move your object and you hold the control key to manually enable snapping, it's going to go back to snapping to the Blender grid. And that does it for snapping things to curvy surfaces. To recap on that, the median point needs to be at the base of whatever your object is, because that's what's going to be sitting on the surface. The normals of your surface object have to be facing outward, so press Ctrl and N in edit mode after you select everything to recalculate the normals. That way everything faces the right direction. Enable the magnet icon, change it from increment to face, make sure active is selected as the snap target, and make sure this icon right next to that is enabled to rotate it based on the face beneath it. And again, when you're done, reset the snap element to increment and turn off the magnet. Now let's do a boring segment on packing and unpacking. Here's our UV mapped cube again, which has a texture image applied to it, right here. Packing and unpacking allows you to pack external files into the blend file itself. Most importantly, images, things you use for textures, like this image right here. When you load images into Blender, Blender still uses the external image file. It doesn't become part of the blend file itself. So if, for example, you save your blend file and upload it without packing everything, any image textures you used, like this one, will not be included with that blend file, so your objects will be missing textures. To pack texture images into your blend file, go to File, External Data, and select Pack into Blend File. This takes all of the external images loaded into Blender and saves them into the blend file itself. Now the blend file will no longer use the external images. That also means that if you go to make changes to those images outside of Blender, the images you packed into Blender will not change. Now you can unpack all of the images too by going to File, External Data, Unpack into Files. Click on that, and here you'll have a bunch of options you can use to unpack those files. You can use files in current directory, create when necessary, or write files to current directory, which creates a folder called textures and writes those files into that folder. And also, if you have other data packed in the blend file like audio, it'll create folders based on the kind of data that you have packed into Blender. So clicking on that unpacks all the files, and now Blender is back to loading in those external images, which means you can also modify those external images and they'll change in Blender. So clicking on one of those options will unpack all the data. Now Blender is back to loading in those external images. And now you can modify those external images as well, and it will update the images in Blender. So that's basically what packing and unpacking is.